Thanks, Roz. There'll be no music or performances today, so apologize in advance for that. But I hope you enjoy what I'm going to talk about. I'm really passionate about this work. So I'm going to start with this cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker a couple years ago. And this is, of course, meant to be a little bit ridiculous, but it's actually not too far afield from what I'm going to be talking about today. So while crowdsourcing over the past few years has produced some really incredible innovations across many different domains, so far very little work has been done to extend crowdsourcing practices to the field of mental health and emotional well-being. And yet I think there are some psychotherapeutic practices, psychotherapeutic interventions that could in fact lend themselves to crowdsourcing to some extent. So as a specific example, this is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's sometimes just referred to as CBT. And it's an evidence-based talk therapy, psychotherapy that's been around for decades. It's known to be really very effective for many disorders: anxiety disorder, major depression, post-traumatic stress, eating disorders, insomnia. Not listed there. It's been used for chronic pain, irritable bowel syndrome. Even some people are trying to explore CBT with psychosis and other disorders. So it's really powerful. I'm not going to go into too much detail about CBT today. For those of you in the class, I think there'll be some students talking a little bit more about it on Friday. For those who won't be here, you'll be happy to know that the code for CBT is available on GitHub. I just discovered this. So actually CBT is a bit of an algorithmic type of therapy. This is obviously a gross oversimplification, but you can check that out. And for now, what I really want to do is focus on the cognitive aspects of CBT. There's a lot of nuances to CBT, but for now, I'm going to focus on the cognitive aspects. And actually, the precursor to CBT was really cognitive therapy. And the main point of this is to help patients identify and debug maladaptive thinking. And what I mean by that is persistent, rigid, negative thinking. I don't necessarily mean hallucinations or persecutory delusional thinking, that kind of thing. I'm really talking about the kinds of negative thinking that a lot of us experience day to day. And I like this definition being from MIT because it has the word debug in there. And it reminds me of my favorite website of all time, which is Stack Overflow. So for the programmers in the room, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Stack Overflow is a question and answer site for computer programmers. So if you have a bug in your code or a problem with your code, you can go to Stack Overflow, you can type in what's wrong with your code, and really within minutes, you'll often get these incredibly sophisticated, elegant solutions from this vast crowd network of computer programmers, and it's all for free. It's really a marvel of collective intelligence. This is not just a simple discussion forum. There's a lot of work that goes into moderating the content, providing the right incentives, and just coordinating this collective intelligence in a really effective way. So when I came to MIT, I came here from psychology departments, and I had a humanities background. I had really almost no computer programming background whatsoever. So I use Stack Overflow all the time. It was one of my main resources, and it was really helpful. But for me, one of the biggest problems with learning to code under extreme pressure was not the bugs in the code themselves, the little problems, but really the way I thought about the bugs in my code. So I would see my code failing again and again, and I'd think to myself, gosh, I'm so stupid. I'll never be able to learn to program. I'll never fit in here at MIT. So what I really wanted to type into a site like this is something like ARG or some other expletive I'm not going to show you. And I found that a lot of people shared this instinct. There's a lot of people being very, very frustrated on Stack Overflow. And of course, Stack Overflow is not meant to help you with this. It's just to help you solve your code and get you on. But it occurred to me that just as we can use something like Stack Overflow to help us find and fix bugs in our code, maybe we can use something similar to help us find and fix bugs in our thinking. So What I really wanted was a Stack Overflow for the mind, a platform that leverages collective intelligence to help people like me think more flexibly about the issues that are upsetting them or stressing them out. And such an approach, I believe, would be effective not just for disgruntled programmers, but really for anyone dealing with stress and persistent negative thinking. And we know that excessive negative thinking is a hallmark of many disorders, including major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder, which, as we know, are unfortunately all too common. So depression can affect up to 30 million adults in the US. It's a leading cause of disability. Anxiety disorder prevalence is probably higher. And even though there are effective psychotherapies like CBT that can work really well for many people, a lot of people just do not go seek out these treatments. And so there are many reasons for this, and there are many barriers to access, and chief among them are cost. It can cost a lot to see a therapist, especially if it's out of network. There's just simple logistics of scheduling an appointment, traveling to an appointment. There's still a lot of stigma to going to see a therapist, so it may be difficult for people to kind of get up the nerve to do that. And the other thing to note is that therapies like CBT do not have the marketing muscle of the psychopharmacological industry. So I'm sure you've seen commercials for Prozac, Wellbutrin, Xanax. I wonder if anyone has seen a commercial for CBT in the audience. And I think that's kind of a shame, because in studies after studies, it shows that it can be as effective as psychopharmacology, but no side effects, and relapse rates are much better. So if you are taking an antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication, when you go off, often you find that a person will relapse. That's not necessarily the case at all with CBT. The relapse rates are a lot better. This is also true for other psychotherapies. You occasionally may have to go in for some booster sessions to refresh your skills, but generally it's pretty nice. So today I'm going to talk about a tool I built in this space. This is sort of my own tool for well-being I worked on for the last couple of years. And I'll describe the design, deployment, and evaluation of this specifically, and hopefully some of the design insights I learned I can share with you to help you, especially in the class if you're building in this space, or anyone who's generally interested in this space. So this is Panoply. This is a crowdsourced platform that administers emotion regulatory support anytime, anywhere. The approach is inspired by and derived from evidence-based therapies like cognitive therapy. And it works by helping users think more flexibly about stressful situations, so that over time they can learn to identify and fix bugs in their thinking on their own. It works not by recruiting trained therapists or counselors, but rather by coordinating the collective intelligence and efforts of crowd workers, all of whom are trained on demand online. So I'll talk a lot about who these crowd helpers are and how we train them, and some of the pros and cons of working with these populations. But before I dive into the specifics of this platform and the results I've seen so far, I think it's useful to go into some of the psychological bases for this. So when you're designing a tool for mental health, I think it's really important to inform your work with existing psychotherapeutic research. The design space is really huge, so there are a lot of things we could think of to build as interventions that might align with our lay intuitions of what might work, but I think it's really informative to try and anchor at least some of the approach in existing knowledge. Otherwise, the space is just so huge. So for this particular work, the motivations actually go all the way back to 100 AD. This is the Roman philosopher Epictetus. And he, along with his contemporaries, really anticipated cognitive behavioral therapy. They were kind of doing their own version of this many thousands of years ago. And they had a lot of the main principles for cognitive therapy they were discussing. And what Epictetus is known for is this quote that says, "What really frightens or dismays us is not external events themselves, but the way in which we think about them." So this is this idea that the content of our thoughts profoundly influences how we feel. And by extension, if we can somehow nudge and mold and reshape the content of our thoughts, we can have a different affective profile, a different emotional experience. It's kind of a type of thinking that you've probably run into. It's an idea that has come up in great works of literature. It's heavy in philosophy. It's part of some religions, and it really forms the basis for a lot of modern psychotherapies, not just CBT, but other therapies like dialectical behavioral therapy. And today, the term for this, as practiced by psychologists, is cognitive reappraisal. You may also hear it referred to as simply reframing. I kind of like to use that term. Some people refer to it as forming adaptive inferences or forming a positive explanatory style. These are all dancing around the same idea, which is when you're faced with stress, there are many techniques at your disposal. This is a cognitive technique, and it involves reinterpreting the thought or situation to alter an emotional experience. So I always like to give a quick example of this to be more concrete, and since it's becoming the Halloween season, I thought I'd use this. So imagine you are a young child and you're watching this scary movie, and your first reaction is you're very afraid. Now, if you're a parent, or if you recall that experience, you know that like one of the stress management strategies people often say is, think about this as an actor wearing makeup. He's probably like a really friendly dad or something. That's actually the actor there. So that's just a very basic example of reinterpreting your framing of the situation using a cognitive technique to downregulate your emotional response. So this idea has a lot of, I think, intuitive appeal for a lot of people, but does it work very well? So it's actually been a really hot topic of psychology for the past dozen years or so. And what psychologists find is that people who report using this strategy habitually to regulate stress and emotions, as opposed to some other strategies, they generally show an enviable affective profile overall. So if you habitually use reappraisal, you're very fluent with this strategy, you show lower incidence of depression, better interpersonal functioning, higher well-being, reduced PTSD symptom severity, and there's some other things as well that I don't have listed on there. Of course, these are correlational studies, so this is just sort of asking people how often do you use reappraisal, maybe testing how well they're doing, and then assessing some of these psychological measures. So it could just be a correlation and there's no causal relationship, but there have been dozens and dozens of psychological studies in the laboratory where they look at this causal link between reappraisal and emotional responding. And what you generally find is that when you ask people to practice reappraisal in the laboratory when they're faced with some laboratory stressor, not only do you see subjectively on the part of the participant emotional relief, a little bit less emotional distress, but you also see really beautiful benefits in terms of cardiovascular functioning. You see reduced skin conductance, autonomic nervous system changes, and also really interesting changes in the brain. So this is an image from a meta-analysis looking at, I think, 48 neuroimaging studies on reappraisal. So it's really a hot topic. And this is a meta-analysis depiction, so the activation patterns might be a little different from what you're looking at, but what you're used to looking at. But the general sort of simplified version of this story is when you're asking people to reframe or practice reappraisal in the lab, you generally see this upregulation of cognitive control regions and regions of the lateral prefrontal cortex in tandem with a downregulation of limbic areas like the amygdala. So these studies are actually really pretty interesting to read about, and the experimental paradigm is pretty interesting. It's partly why reappraisal has been studied so often is there's some pretty interesting ways you can actually test it in a brain scanner. So the way one of these studies typically works is you go into the scanner and they'll show you some provocative images, maybe images that are distressing, or maybe there'll be little text vignettes of something distressing. And as a participant, it's a little intimidating. You're lying in this tube, and you're asked to either just experience what you're seeing and not try to regulate your mood, just let your emotions flow, So that's one condition. They'll have you do that. Then they might have you try a different strategy, like just suppressing everything. Try not to feel anything. Just dampen everything you're feeling. And then they'll also have you apply reappraisal. They'll instruct you to look at what you're seeing and try to reinterpret the meaning of it in a sort of cognitive linguistic fashion to regulate your emotion. And in those strategies, you see these really beautiful divergent consequences of what you're being asked to do with this sort of prototypical response pattern when you use reappraisal. And then simultaneously, subjects in the lab also note just feeling a little bit less distressed using that tactic. So in psychology, there's a lot of work on understanding these kinds of mechanisms at the intrapersonal level, like within the individual, but I'm sure we all know that we do not regulate our mood and our emotions in a vacuum. Our peers and our social situations are very important. And in fact, there's considerable research showing this inverse relationship between social support and depression. So the stronger your social support ties are, this tends to have a protective factor against depression. And there are many possible mechanisms for why this might be. It's still very much an open question in the research field. But lately, a lot of researchers have been starting to consider whether social support might protect against things like anxiety and depression through something like reappraisal. So the idea is that a support provider might be able to select alternative reappraisals for you and call upon resources unavailable to the depressed person. So as an example, imagine you are at work and you just get laid off. And your first intuition, this would probably be mine, is to think, I'm a lousy employee, this is a reflection of me, a lousy employee, and I'd kind of narrow in on this one negative, rigid interpretation, maybe ruminate about it. And the idea is that when you're stressed in such a stressful situation, your creative faculties tend to get a little bit degraded. And having social support peers can be really helpful. You can have a friend just remind you of some of the obvious things that maybe the company laid off a lot of people. Maybe the friend would remind you that, hey, didn't you really hate your boss and aren't you eager to leave? And hey, now you can pursue that thing that you wanted to. It's sort of having an external hard drive to rely upon to provide more processing power when you're stressed. So that's kind of the idea. So if you have a really great peer support network, and that's a beautiful way to help regulate stress and emotion. Of course, there are times when you might want to remain anonymous, even with your peers or your family members. There are also times where you might want to just practice some of these techniques over and over. And I'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of practicing these repeatedly. And for that, a crowdsourcing platform might be pretty interesting. And so I'll talk a little bit about how that might work. So with respect to crowdsourcing, it's kind of blown up over the last 10 years. A lot of businesses are using this practice. I should know it's been probably overhyped at this point, so most of those squares on there are probably businesses that no longer exist. But I think the general principle is really intriguing and useful. And one of the more intriguing crowdsourcing platforms, in my view, is something called Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So when I came across this several years ago, it kind of blew my mind with the kinds of things you can do with this platform. The main use cases are a little pedestrian to me, but you can be really creative with this. So what this is Amazon's online labor market, and it's a place where you can go online and you can post a job that you need to get done. These typically tend to be short, circumscribed jobs, like I need to label 50 images, and you might pay 3 cents for each label you get. And you can also go on here as a worker and do these types of jobs. And you see all sorts of people gravitating to this, both as employer, a requester, and a worker. There are people who use this at home just to have some fun and make some money when they're bored, or sometimes at work instead of playing solitaire. People are going on Mechanical Turk and kind of gamifying this process of making money. So there are actually a lot of people on here. There's hundreds of thousands of people registered on this platform. But what's really interesting about it is it has an API, which gets computer scientist people really excited, like me. So with that, you can exploit the API and algorithmically coordinate human labor in these really interesting, complex ways. And there have been a lot of interesting research projects at MIT specifically that have exploited this API, where they're building these applications and tools where the core computational power is not artificial intelligence, it's human intelligence. It's people from these networks being requested to do work at the time like the end user might need some work. And as I'll show, there's some really intricate, interesting ways you can coordinate how work gets done with these platforms. The other thing quickly I want to just mention is the existing space of computer-based psychotherapies. So this is a really interesting new area of research that has sprung up over the past decade or so. And it's pretty broad, but it's still a very new space. There are a couple of main areas that people traffic in this space. There is something called Teletherapy or virtual therapy. This is where you're simply connecting patients and clients to a therapist through something like Skype or text messaging or an online chat room. And it's really kind of reducing some of these barriers to access. The disadvantages to this are it still can cost a lot of money. Some of these services cost a lot. And there's also just lingering stigma that can still be at play here. And of course, the scalability of this is a little questionable, how many people you can get out. So the other approach is to consider web applications and mobile applications that are entirely self-guided. There's no therapist or counselor in the loop in these types of systems. And so what these do is these apps will start to teach you and train you to learn some of the core techniques that you might learn in a traditional psychotherapeutic session. It's obviously very different, but it's a different way to disseminate some of these core ideas, something like reappraisal and some of these behavioral strategies to help you. The advantage of these are pretty huge. They are inexpensive, extremely scalable. If you have something that works, there's no reason it can't extend to millions and millions of people. It's accessible. You can consult these things at 4 in the morning. You don't have to wait for your weekly session or whatever. And what's also cool is you can get a lot of interesting data, out of these types of services. You can start to iterate more quickly and sort of look towards these lean design principles that you can never really do in a clinic. So you can start learning what's working for what type of person by looking at the data and iteratively hone the apps in some pretty interesting ways. So there have been a few products out there in this space. This is one of the earliest ones called Beating the Blues. It came out of, I think, United Kingdom. A lot of the best work in this space has actually come from UK, Australia, and New Zealand, where the health systems really actively support this work. And then there's some apps you can get on the phone. This is an app you can download on your iPhone or Android called MindShift. And these services are pretty interesting. There's been a lot of rigorous randomized controlled trials assessing the efficacy of these things. So can a simple app on the web or on the phone actually improve people's depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms without a therapist? And the answer is yes. The effect size is generally smaller than what you'd see in the clinic, but there are some studies showing equivalent effect sizes. So it's a really promising area to think about as a way to reach more people and get them exposed to things that can be really helpful for them. The problem is there's still a lot of design work that needs to be done in this space. So I've downloaded dozens of these apps, and they're getting a little bit better, but most of them are pretty heinous when it comes to design. And I'm being charitable with that word there. But they generally lack usability, and they lack social features and personalization that might make the apps more captivating. There are a whole host of sort of design flaws that I see. One of my favorite ones is something called a psychological skeuomorph. This is the idea that you're taking a metaphor from a clinical therapy and you're transplanting it into the app without really much concern about what this might do for your end user. So here you see an app where you're choosing a virtual therapist and you have a clipboard where you're filling out things. And if you think about it, a lot of people are downloading these apps perhaps because they want to avoid associations that of clinical associations. And you might ask yourself why anyone would want to have an experience on their phone of sitting in a waiting room with a clipboard when there's really no need for that. So, I think there's a lot of space to innovate really heavily here. A lot of things that people do as well is they'll really transform what works in the clinic into the phone or the web application in a way that preserves almost everything they can about the clinical experience. And this is not a bad intuition, right? Because these practices have been honed for decades. But what ends up happening is you'll have an iPhone application that has you reading page after page of text on your phone or watching an hour-long video, which doesn't really capture how people use technology today. And it's something I'm going to go into in a bit. And so what ends up happening is while these applications can work really well in these rigorous controlled trials where you have an experimenter or a clinician really in the loop all the time telling you, please use this, when you set them out into the wild, when people are willing to download them, adherence rates drop precipitously. So if the benefit of these apps is to provide greater access, there's a problem if accessibility is not a valuable resource if no one wants to access the content in the first place. So by comparison, there are a whole host of other services people flock to that are actually way more engaging by many estimates. There are these online peer support networks, social support networks. There are products like Spill, things like Whisper or Secret. These anonymous messaging apps fall into the space loosely. There's online discussion boards. And there are some problems with these too. They're often unmoderated, so you can get some pretty awful responses sometimes. But even perhaps more obviously is they're not tailored to reinforce or disseminate evidence-based intervention techniques. So people often really enjoy these platforms. They get immediate social support, immediate place to vent what's bothering them. They get to see other people with issues like themselves. But the question is, when they walk away from that, have they gained any enduring skill that can help them offline in a substantial way? And the research to date suggests maybe not. There still needs to be better research in this space, but across the board, especially if you look at mental health, I think the data is a little better for some other health issues. But for mental health issues like depression and anxiety, sometimes you see symptoms not improving. Other times you see them getting worse, especially if these discussion places are unmoderated. And there's some reasons for that. So with this project, I wanted to see if there was a sweet spot I could kind of traverse in the middle here, where like self-guided interventions, I wanted to build Panoply around some of these more structured therapeutic concepts so that while you're using it, you're at least exposed to this to some extent. And also wanted to leverage some of these really engaging aspects of social support systems, but also fill that need of getting access to core therapeutic content. So to state it a bit more succinctly, the idea is to design mental health technology that is engaging and as personalized as person-to-person interventions without sacrificing the benefits that come from purely self-administered approaches like accessibility, anonymity, and scalability. All right, so let me talk about this platform. This is still very much a work in progress. But to describe how it works, I often find it useful to refer to question and answer sites. I imagine many of you may have used at least one of these at some point. So the design of Panoply really mimics a lot of the frameworks around these. You can post on the site. In this case, you're not posting questions, but rather you're posting descriptions of thoughts that are bothering you. You can act as a respondent and respond to other people. Like a question and answer site, you can go in and you can review the content you're getting. And you can also get a sense of how well you're doing by reviewing how people review your content. That being said, it is quite a bit different from existing question and answer sites. And to explain why I find it useful, just to go through an example that I've used a few times. So let's imagine a user has logged in, activated the account, and they post a stressful situation. They write, "I really like my friends, but they're all kind of alpha male types, very extroverted and such. I'm not, and so I get ignored a lot." And then they write, the interface asks them to capture the automatic negative thoughts they're having about the situation. And they write, "I feel like a loser when I'm with my friends and I never say anything. I feel like they only just tolerate my presence." So this basic structure of posting in this way is really inspired from CBT thought records. But it's also changed quite a bit just to make it a little bit less friction for the user and helps them fill it out a bit quicker. So once you fill it out, you click send, and then your content gets sent out to crowd helpers, and they come from two sources at this stage. Some of the crowd helpers come from Mechanical Turk, and some come from Panoply. So again, like a question and answer site, we want people to be respondents as well as people who post things. So Mechanical Turk, as I mentioned, costs money. So why would you want to use something like this? And as I'll tell you, the quality of the work on here can be a lot harder to manage. Well, there's a few reasons why I'm using Turk right now. One is that it's a beautiful prototyping tool. So anytime I change something in the interface, I can have access to Mechanical Turk workers to test it out for me. The other really beautiful thing about it is, even at this stage when I'm just developing this app and there's very few people on it at a given time, when Mechanical Turk is in the loop, you have the semblance of a pretty vast, vibrant social community just instantly. So you can actually get pretty quick response times because there's always going to be someone on Mechanical Turk I can find and recruit and bring in. You can ask Turk workers to review the posts to make sure there's nothing troubling being sent to the system, and you can ask them to help curate and review responses too. So they're really good for that. And okay, so why would you want to use Panoply users? Maybe the system would be best if you just posted and you didn't respond. Well, the answer is that in my studies so far, they tend to produce much better responses. And this goes back to how they're motivated. They're not motivated to make money as quickly as possible. Presumably, they've signed on because they're interested in a stress reduction app and they're interested in helping people. And those motivations align a lot better with quality than how quickly you can write something, get paid, and not get dinged on the Mechanical Turk framework. The other important thing is Panoply really, the core element of this is this peer-based learning model where you learn the techniques most deeply, in my view, by teaching them to other people. So being a respondent on the system, in my view, is actually almost as important, if not more so, than posting and receiving feedback from people. It helps you just get exposure to some of these concepts again and again in an engaging way. So what happens when you post and it gets sent to the crowd? So right now, the system has some algorithms to manage this. It will recruit various crowd workers to compose different types of responses. They each get trained to do this. There's another set of crowd that comes in and reviews the responses, extends them further. So some of you in the class are using this, and I should note that I'm still iterating with this feedback loop, so it's been on and off a little bit, so if your results aren't as consistent as they might be, I apologize. But I'll talk a lot about the trade-offs with this moderation loop and having humans do it. It's actually a really tricky design question that I'm still grappling with. And so let's take a look at what the crowd gives back to people. So again, imagine you're that individual who's feeling shy around your alpha male friends, you don't get to say anything. So let's take a look at the empathy responses. I'm just going to zoom in here on what one of those looks like. So this person says, "I'm sorry to hear you're feeling marginalized in your friend group. I'm also a quiet person in groups, so I know the feeling. It's easy to feel self-conscious and awkward, or to feel like you're not really part of the group, but you are." So the goal of this response is just to help the user feel validated, help the user feel understood. a lot of these cognitive techniques like reframing can be challenging for people. So the idea is that the app ideally will help load you up with some of these comments first to make you feel heard and listened to before someone starts to just gently challenge your cognition. So that was the intuition for doing this. It's a socio-affective cushion, hopefully, where like some of the more challenging things can land a bit softer. As with anything, you can review stuff, you can send a thank you note. If you see something you don't like, you can block the person too. So there's some crowd curation stuff going on. The other aspect that comes back to you is something called cognitive restructuring. This is a practice from CBT. And this really goes back to what I was talking about earlier with Stack Overflow and trying to find a bug in your thinking. This is really that practice. So here the crowd has been taught to read the text and try and find one of these prototypical bugs that we see and we talk about in cognitive therapy. And these can be a variety of different things. So here the crowd looks like they're kind of converging on a mind-reading bug. And I believe that's probably referring to that last sentence. I feel like they only just tolerate my presence. So this is the idea that this person might be overestimating their ability to read other people's thoughts. And if you think and reflect on this, you can probably note many times where you felt this way only to have found some evidence that totally proved you wrong. So the idea here is just to let people know that this might be going on. It tells you what the bug is, and it gives you some intuitions about how to kind of reframe the thought you're having so it's a little bit more logical and less prone to that. So the idea is that these distortions in your thinking can be disputed. And once you dispute them and have a bit more of a logical assessment of the situation, not necessarily overly bright-sided, but just more logical, that will help reduce the anxiety. So moving forward, I think there's a lot more that can be done with this. This is really just prototyping this aspect at first, but a lot of people in the study and users have asked for more ways to expand on this, and I think that's an interesting idea. The other thing, final thing that I'm having people do is compose a general purpose reappraisal for a person. So look at the statement and try to find alternative interpretations that might be a bit more realistic, a bit more adaptive. So here's one here. So someone's saying it's okay not to be the most outspoken or alpha in a group. Maybe your friends prefer to be the center of attention and they appreciate your quiet demeanor. They probably aren't ignoring you or leaving you out on purpose. They may just think you're more introverted and prefer to be on the sidelines. Here's another one. There's nothing wrong with being introverted and quiet. If that is who you are, I'm also a quiet type, and more often than not, people understand that. Many famous people are introverts. Introverts observe and think more, which makes them more wise and creative. So these are pretty basic ideas, somewhat generic in some sense. But if you imagine this person really perseverating on this issue, the stress of that just may make them less able to access these kind of obvious alternative interpretations. So what you observe in like peer relationships is that the peer will kind of help nudge the person here. And here it's just using crowdsourcing to make that happen a little bit more easy and quickly. So how do we train people to do this? So I'm presuming when I build this that all the crowd helpers have no background in psychology. They're not therapists, they're not counselors. So there are these different modules that people go through. Whether you're a mechanical Turk worker or a user on the site, you go through these modules and you get trained before you're able to respond to a person. And for my design, I really wanted to make these training modules very quick. So I'll often introduce the concept for you. I try to use non-clinical language as much as possible, and I try to use an example that's easy to understand. And then as a user, you're asked to go through and kind of review other responses that people may have made and try and guess which one is the better response. And the interface will give you some reminders about why a response is good and why a response is bad. And the idea with that is to help people understand where previous respondents have gone wrong. So this was like a year or more of work trying to find ways to shape people's understanding of these concepts so that they could understand them very quickly. And then the interface gives you some additional tips when you're composing your responses, and an additional sort of review process to help you compose a nice response to a person. So quality, as I mentioned, can be an issue with these systems. It still is an issue. But there are a lot of ways to help moderate that. With Mechanical Turk, one of the biggest problems is English language fluency. There are people all over the world using this system. Right now, the majority is India and the US, but you see people all over the world, and they're always eager to do jobs that pay well. And I tend to pay pretty well, I think, with my jobs. So there are people like kind of dying to get in, and they may accept the task and start doing it without actually really understanding the instructions, and then you'll get responses that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. So when I was first doing that, that happened a lot. I'd get responses where it was clear the person hadn't read or understood what was happening. So to solve this, I've done a couple things. One is I check the IP address of people coming in. I make sure they're coming in from an English-speaking country. And then the other thing, which worked amazingly well, is I give them a short SAT test. So I make them kind of go back to high school for a second and go through this short SAT verbal test. Each time you load it, it's different questions, so it's very hard to cheat. And even just these 2 questions, getting those right, I found that really helps a lot. And as I mentioned, there's also ways to get the crowd itself to review responses. So this is kind of what I'm tinkering with now a little bit. So in the previous study that I've done, mostly I wanted to eliminate rude responses, abusive responses, gibberish responses, and that worked pretty well. But right now I'm trying to also find a way for the crowd to get at that more qualitative sense of, is this a tactful response? Is this a powerful response? And that is actually really, really hard to do because the way you interpret these responses is so personal. There's a lot of variance. Sometimes I'll read a response that I think is just horrible, and then I'll look at the data and the person who got it really loved it. So it can be really person-specific about what kind of thing might resonate you at a given time, and of course also person-specific whether this type of intervention is appealing to you. So to evaluate this, I ran a randomized controlled trial. And my main questions were getting at the twin aims of this research project was I wanted to see whether using this type of thing repeatedly would show therapeutic efficacy. And I also wanted to see whether people were starting to get engaged with some of the social dynamics of the system. So I recruited pretty broadly. There were a lot of people from MIT that signed up, but I also recruited through Twitter, Facebook, Craigslist, various research websites. I got a lot of people from the Positive Psychology Network, which I believe people in the class are reading Flourish or part of that. So that's that positive psychology space. And incidentally, those I think were some of my better participants, perhaps because they were really gravitating to the idea of helping people. So the idea is you want to randomly assign people that come in and consent to do this study. And I randomly assign them to either use Panoply, which is what I've described, or use a control task, which was an expressive writing task. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted to make the control task as similar to Panoply as possible to avoid any confounding factors. So this is actually a screenshot of the control task. It was actually called Panoply. It had the same graphic design, the same logo. And what people were doing in this control task was they were just posting things. It was sort of an online journaling exercise. They were told that writing down descriptions of negative situations, stressful thoughts in this structured way would help contextualize their problems, perhaps provide distance from that. And we actually know there's data that doing this can be really helpful. So the control task was identical to the treatment except for the things I was really interested in. I was interested in these active ingredients of reappraisal training and the crowdsourced interaction. And as I mentioned before, the control task contains some active therapeutic ingredients. So this actually is an intervention. Writing down descriptions of negative thoughts and feelings over and over is something called expressive writing. It's an intervention that's been looked at since the 80s, I think, and it's known to confer some psychological benefits on its own. So I wanted to see whether Panoply would confer equal or greater benefit. And I wanted to conduct as rigorous a RCT, randomized controlled trial, as possible. There are a lot of randomized controlled trials out there where your control is just a wait list, where you might be just waiting for 3 weeks or so. And that has some advantages to it, which I don't have too much time to go into, but if you're curious in the questions, I can talk more about these experimental designs. But the problem with a wait list, or even getting someone to do an inert task, like sometimes in this space, people will ask people to describe what they did the previous day, just list out their activities, and the message to the participant will be like, structuring your thinking will help you reduce stress, or something like that. The problem with those is that they're not even necessarily placebos, they can be nocebos, where people actually can get a little bit worse. And there's some interesting research showing that even in waitlist controls, people might get a little bit worse, so that might even exaggerate your effects beyond what you should be seeing. So what do you look at in this kind of study? So I was really interested in looking pretty broadly, because this is the first time I did this. And I was looking at, most importantly, I was looking at depression symptoms, because this is so structured around CBT, which is really the gold standard for depression interventions. I was looking at depression symptoms, but I also looked at some of the more positive affect types of measures, like subjective happiness. This PANOS-PA is looking at positive affect. How often do you feel excitement, interest, these kinds of things? And then I was also looking at risk factors that might be precursors to depression, particularly cognitive precursors. So I was looking at something called perseverative thinking. This is also known as rumination. This is this idea that when you're worried about something, or you're regretting something, or you're stressed, rumination is this process of thinking about it over and over in a very unproductive way. And that can be a really strong risk factor for depression and even suicide. So it's a pretty interesting thing to look at. And then I also looked at reappraisal, the extent to which people use that. So the study design, let's see, I want to make sure I have the study design in here. But just to make sure you understand, so people would come in, they'd be randomly assigned. First thing I'd do is I'd run these assessments at baseline, see how they're doing. They would use whatever they were assigned for 3 weeks, and then they would come back and fill out their assessments again. And this was all done online. There were no face-to-face interactions with the experimenter. People were incentivized to complete the questionnaires, but I really tried to work hard not to incentivize them to do the activities. I wanted to see whether they would do it on their own. So they were not paid. Payment was not contingent on using the app. What happened was, if you filled out your final questionnaires, you were then eligible to win an iPad. So I kind of had to walk this fine line where if I didn't give them anything, they wouldn't fill out these questionnaires because they're boring. But if I paid them for everything they did, it would be really hard to assess engagement, right? Because that's what you typically see in these experiments. So with that baseline assessment, a lot of my participants did fall into the clinical cutoff for depression as defined by this scale. So that was the group I was really interested in. So the main analyses were looking at this group specifically. And these are the results. So I'm just going to zoom in on the top row for now. So this is the change in positive measures over time. So you want to see those lines going up. And you see that both groups do improve over time, but that the improvement is greater for Panoply for these types of measures. And then this bottom row is showing you assessments that we want to see drop over time. So we want to see depression scores go down. We want to see negative affect go down. We definitely want to see perseverative thinking go down. And so here we see significant differences between Panoply and writing with depression and perseverative thinking. So individually, both had pretty significant changes, but I'm really most interested in where Panoply outperformed the writing group. So if we zoom in on depression, here's another way to look at it. This is looking at change score. So you're looking at that bar is showing you how much people dropped. And individually, both interventions yielded significant reductions over time in depression symptoms. But Panoply significantly outperformed the control group. The effect was not huge, but it was definitely significant. And another way to look at it is 32% of Panoply participants experienced a 50% reduction in symptoms versus 18% in the writing group. So the next thing I wanted to look at was everyone. So not just depressed individuals as defined by this questionnaire. Again, this is just one questionnaire. So I wanted to see like how everyone might do. And you do find some benefits, but the most striking one is up in the upper right-hand corner there, the reappraisal. So you find that people using Panoply over time really reported getting more at ease with reappraisal and using it more often in their day-to-day lives, which is really great because that is the core technique that this platform is really training people for. So the next thing I wanted to do was, if Panoply may be working through teaching reappraisal, it may be the case that if you're already good at reappraisal, you already use this as a strategy, and we know through individual differences studies that people sometimes already naturally do this quite a bit. Maybe the intervention's not that great for you if you're already pretty good at this one strategy. So let's split the group into people who are high reappraisers and low reappraisers at baseline. So maybe people who have deficits in this are particularly going to do well. And so here are the people who reported not using reappraisal, and here you see that the differences are particularly dramatic when you compare to writing. And this makes sense because the writing task really wasn't explicitly targeting reappraisal in any fashion. The other thing that's important to evaluate with these kinds of tools is not just these clinical measures, but you want to assess perceived effectiveness. So if your users don't really feel like they're getting any benefit out of it, they'll probably stop using it pretty quickly. So even if it does help them, and there could be many cases where you're actually getting noticeable results, but they're maybe not associating it with the intervention, or they just aren't able to reflect on it. So you want to look at self-coping. So this is an assessment of how well they felt they managed stress after the intervention. I also looked at the extent to which they thought they were better suited to helping other people after this intervention. And I think this is an interesting area to look at further. I'm only kind of touching on this, but the neat thing about this type of application to me is, unlike these self-guided apps where you're working by yourself on your own problems, and one of the nice side effects of this is you're learning to be a better peer support in some sense. And this can create this virtuous circle where offline you might be a better supporter to someone else. So the other thing to look at is how often they use this application. And there are a lot of ways to measure engagement in this field. But I'm just going to show you a couple that I thought were meaningful for this study. So most of the activity on Panoply is word count. You want to see how many words people are submitting to the system. And overwhelmingly, people wrote a lot more responses and posts in Panoply and just did a lot more. The other thing you can look at is average sessions per user. This is from Google Analytics data, so it's a little suspicious to me. I'm not able to get variance estimates, so I can't do stats on it, but it's at least sort of indicating people were using Panoply a lot more frequently. And then you can get some self-report data on user experience. The other thing I looked at was how many replies people were making in the system. And you see a very typical long tail that you would see with any kind of consumer application. What's nice is that there are people here kind of near the tail submitting way more than 50 replies in 3 weeks. Some people submitted over 150. That's a lot of writing. So these replies tend to be 2 to 3 sentences, 3 to 4 sentences. So that's a lot of material. So for the right person, it seems to captivate them pretty well. The other thing, this is new data from some colleagues at Columbia that are looking at this data as well. And one of the other things you want to look at is something called the dose-response relationship to try and see whether activity on your platform is predicting improvements in any way. What we see is, if you look at the left one, it's looking at a log transformed data of the number of help messages people give. This is a number of responses. And you want to see that line going down. So it's the more responses you want to see, the more reduction in depression. So we're starting to see a significant trend that the more you help on the system, the better you fare. The other one is interesting. This is looking at the number of posts, which are correlated with the number of help messages to some extent, but the pattern's a little bit different. So if you don't post at all or very little, you don't get much improvement. And then it kind of dips, you get a little bit of improvement. And then if you're someone who's posting a lot, we're starting to see some patterns where they're actually not improving much. And this is interesting. It could mean a couple things. It could mean if you're really troubled going in, you might be posting a lot, and this intervention may just not be broad enough to help you. It may also mean that during the intervention, some new stressors came up that may have also challenged the system to reduce depression over time. So a couple more things I just want to share before I wrap up is looking at individual differences among people using this. So I've stated a few times that the Panoply users tended to produce much better responses than the Turk workers. So if you are in the class and using this, most likely your interactions will primarily be with Turk workers. And what people qualitatively would say in the study is that the Turk workers sometimes would write kind of copy-paste sorts of statements, or it would be really cliched and not well thought out. So I think that's kind of tapping into this difference in motivation. So while Turk is really great for testing and having a crowd immediately at your disposal, even with these kind of ridiculous efforts I made to train them and vet them, they still are underperforming significantly. The other thing I wanted to look at was how well do depressed versus non-depressed people fare when giving responses. So there's some interesting competing hypotheses here. So on the one hand, some level of cognitive impairment is often a diagnostic indicator of depression or a hallmark of depression. On the other hand, there's this whole other body of research saying that negative affect and negative mood can help you fare well in some situations. It might help you have more focus and scrutinize things a little bit more. And there's actually some data looking at how well people respond politely in social situations, and that low mood actually, in some cases, will make you fare better there. And what I found was no real difference. This is not significant. It does look like there's a little trend showing that, in general, responses from depressed individuals were less favorable, but I did not see a significant difference. And more than that, I saw that the depressed individuals generally use the system more often. So if you look at the standpoint of who's a good contributor, they outperformed. The other thing I looked at was these thank you notes. That's another way to sort of vet how the responses are doing. If you tend to be pretty moved, you might actually write a thank you note to someone. I was not sure at all whether this would be used. This was one of these elements I didn't do much user testing on, but I did find that a lot of thank you notes were exchanged over time, which is really encouraging, because I think if you're an end user and you go out of your way to write something, that means that you like the response. So I think it's helpful just to show a full interaction on the system. There were hundreds of really beautiful interactions, particularly I think when the study participants were working together. And there was a part in the study where all the participants were kind of using the system, and there was a lot of churn, and they were all working with each other. So here's one where it says, I ended a 2.5-year relationship with my boyfriend. I'm not getting any younger. I'm not where I thought I would be at this point in my life. I hate the thought of starting over. Everyone else in my peer group is engaged, married, and having children. What is wrong with me? So this is, I believe, a reframe response, and someone wrote, a good thing to remember is that with that chapter of your life ending, a new chapter is beginning. Starting over can be scary, but it's also a great opportunity. The fact that you're able to step out of your relationship into an uncertain future says that you are a strong and brave individual, ready to experience new things that life has to offer. So if you look at the typical social support apps on the internet now, I would venture to say it'd be really rare to see something as thought out like that. And this person really liked it, so they wrote a really nice thank you note to that individual, which then in turn might help that individual want to make more responses. And if we look back at that dose response graph, I'm starting to see that the more responses you make, maybe the better your outcomes are over time. So when I started this project, I really kind of wanted something that would assist me when I'm really frustrated and stressed out and help me think differently. And I think that can be really powerful for people. They noted that that was powerful, but I've now evolved in my thinking to think that by rehearsing these exercises over and over, that may be the most therapeutic thing. So one positive psychologist has mentioned this idea of the Tetris effect. So if any of you have played Tetris and binged on it like I have for like 8 hours at a time, what happens? Well, you go and you start to like move something in your closet, or you're packing your trunk, and everything is like a brick that you're trying to fit. So a similar idea is like if you're rehearsing reframing over and over and over, the idea is that hopefully automatically when you're beset with something, you won't just gravitate to one negative interpretation and stick with it. You might just kind of automatically start exploring some of these other interpretations. So qualitatively, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this. I'm still hoping to get more insights into what people like and what they dislike and how to improve it. I think there's a lot of interesting ways to build and improve it. Some people wanted more training. I wanted to make this really quick and easy, but actually people wanted more training. A lot of people were a little bit nervous and hesitant to compose responses. That was a little stressful at first for people, so they might need just more help doing that initially. A lot of people thought the cognitive restructuring debugging was too simplistic. But a lot of people really liked it, and I think for the right person, this can be a really powerful thing. So when you're trying to build tools for mental health and well-being, you could think of things like games or social support systems, and kind of exploiting these naturally engaging mechanisms. You have to understand that not everyone's going to want to play a game. Not everyone will want to engage socially with people like this. But for the right person, at least in my study, I found a lot of people really liking it and sending me a lot of unsolicited emails about how enthusiastic they were. I really like this quote. This person writes, I found it was like learning a new useful and important life skill to become a better person. So again, this touches on this idea of training people to be better peer supporters. And also just getting into that idea of rumination I was talking about, getting stuck in a cycle. This person's writing, I'm the type of person who gets stuck in a singular channel of thinking, and once I think of something, I get fixated on it, and I can't think of other possible reasons. The reframe responses help me look at the situation differently, allowing me to break out of my cycle. So it's nice to have some qualitative data touching on this, but also quantitative data showing that perseverative thinking went down in tandem. I did have a couple people who self-reported as and self-identified as either having some training in CBT or being counselors who use this study. So the question is, how does this community think about it? And they tended to like it, at least in the study. And as I've talked with other psychologists in this space, once you start talking about tools that expand access to people who are unable and unwilling to receive traditional therapy, they really light up. And there's also this idea that if you're in therapy, this tool might be best for people who are already in therapy, and they can start practicing things in between sessions. So it could be an ancillary treatment that could be used. So those are some ideas. So the last thing I want to wrap up is some design principles that I sort of feel really strongly about and that have come out of this space as researchers are trying to develop better mental health tools and technologies. One is this idea, and this might be a little controversial for some people, but I believe that the idea is you want to adapt the therapy to technology and vice versa. So the downside is, you're not preserving everything that is held sacrosanct in the clinical setting. You have to transform it a little bit, because if you don't, then you're going to have a form factor or an interaction experience that just doesn't fit how people use technology. So rather, you want to design for snackability, especially if you're building a mobile application. So snackability is this idea that we tend to snack on digital tools and technologies now, perhaps more so than ever. So we use something when we're standing in line for coffee or we're waiting for something. So if your intervention doesn't allow someone to at least achieve something in that space, if your intervention only consists of a 1-hour movie, that might not work for people. You want to take advantage of all the great interactivity that technology can give people and designed for these core motivations like autonomy and competence, which is a big area of psychology. And you can do that by giving people more freedom in terms of when they want to use it, what activities they want to use. Give them a feeling that their actions are being rated or evaluated, and let them know when they're doing well. And then the final thing is you want to take advantage, if you can, of some persuasive design techniques. So a lot of existing applications are replete with a lot of tools to help persuade people to use their systems over and over. This involves push notifications, all sorts of things that you'd find on really popular sites like Facebook and Reddit and things like that, to the extent that you can reuse these and incorporate them so that people return to your system again and again. I think that's good. So to wrap up, I'd like to note that this would be the first scalable crowd-powered system for mental health. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think the results so far are pretty interesting. I found in the randomized controlled trial that overall it conferred psychological benefits more so than the control task. I saw evidence that people were engaged with the platform, definitely more so than the control task. And the other thing is, beyond any immediate practical benefits, this is a great research platform. So I've started to have more collaborations with other universities, looking at the data to see how can we understand better how people regulate emotions in more naturalistic settings. The way you typically study this social emotional regulation is really not sort of naturalistic at all. It involves you recalling events maybe years before and trying to recall what your friend might have said to you. So the research tools around this are not very good, but this type of platform can really help with that. There's some interesting ways we can use the data collected on the site to build better classifiers and just help the site work a little bit better. So with regard to moderation, when you have a crowd curating responses, that can be really slow. So the extent that I can work with someone like Karthik to build more automated methods to automatically detect when someone's writing something rude or inappropriate, then you don't have to have the crowd. But the nice thing is that I can start collecting all this data now. So I think that's an interesting area of research. There are ways to start automatically detecting cognitive distortions based on my data because I have the input and all the labels for it. So that could have some really interesting applications too, even outside of an intervention. So lastly, I just want to acknowledge there are a lot of people that helped, particularly in the media lab, particularly affective computing group, my advisor Roz and everyone in the group. And also some colleagues at other universities were pretty pivotal in shaping this work over the last couple years. I also had some great undergraduate research assistants. I really want to thank study participants. So for people in the class kind of working through this platform, I really want to thank you because that's how I learn what's working, what's not working. I also want to thank the Mechanical Turk participants who some of them, I've been kind of nagging on them, but some of them write really beautiful responses and go above and beyond. And I really want to thank them for just trying some of my tasks on that platform. So that's all I have today. If you're interested in trying that, there's a sign up there. It's still in alpha stage, so use it at your own risk, I guess, at this point. But I will let you know. I'm actively working hard to improve it and make it more scalable and for people who are interested in this, giving them freedom to use it. Thank you.
Yes, I am asked to take a mic to take questions from the audience. Yes, Patty.
Really very interesting work, I think. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about the vetting of the answers, the quality control of the answers. What's the process that you use? Like if one person responds, how many people look at that, and which ones are you let go through and which ones you don't?
Yeah.
And then related question is sort of, have you had professionals systematically rate responses as well to see sort of what they think about the quality of the responses?
Okay, yeah. I'm trying to get a screenshot of what it looks like too. There it is. this is one of the review processes. As I mentioned now, I'm actually actively retesting this and trying some new things. So the way it worked in the study, and it's not active now, but in the study, anytime a response was composed, 3 Turk workers would be recruited to look at it. So they'd look at the response only, and then they would have to fill this out. So the idea is that hopefully if you get a majority of people agreeing that it's okay. But even then, you could get something slip through, because the tricky thing with Turk is that over time, if they realize that I'm not actually evaluating whether they're doing the task, they can start to cheat and just click through. So it's definitely not fail-safe. The other thing I have in terms of reviewing is I also review the posts that come in. So this was something that was really important in the context of the study design for IRB approval. And so if anyone is posting something that suggests suicidality or self-harm, another set of crowd workers is also vetting that in a similar fashion. And if there is something alarming, what the system does is it blocks that from going out to other people. And then there's an automated resource list that gets sent to them to help them remember that this is not for crisis situations, it's a self-help tool, et cetera. In terms of having professionals, I do have a couple of people at Columbia trying to make some ratings. They're interested in understanding more about what are the qualities that make a good response, just scientifically understanding that problem. But I think it'll be interesting to see how their ratings match up with Turk worker ratings, although they're going to get a little bit more subjective in terms of like subjectivity of it. Mm-hmm.
Is there any work that you do that makes the answer more sincere, or appear to be more sincere and more personalized, so they sort of form a connection with them? It's like a sincerity problem?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a sincerity problem with this work, particularly if you are motivated to go as fast as possible. You can, if you're not really thinking hard about it, it can come through in the response, at least in my impression. So the question I guess you're asking is, how do you deal with that problem? I think there are a couple approaches. One is making sure that people in the site are motivated to be there. Right now, the problem having Turk is it's sort of, I need them right now to test hypotheses about what's working and what's not. Ideally, this would be more of a community that self-selects to be there rather than just trying to make money or doing a homework assignment, right, for example. So I think that's a huge part, is like who your committee is. In terms of like getting at sincerity, there are a couple of things that touch along that I think are existing problems. So one problem that I have with stuff when I use it is people sometimes will write what in psychology we call a Pollyanna response. This is this idea that you're really optimistic. So if we go back to some of those examples, like there's an example of like your boss yells at you. You might get a response where the person says, well, I know your boss will be fired next week, so then you'll have a vacation in France and you'll meet a celebrity and blah, blah, blah. That's an exaggeration, but you do see that. And I think if people are getting feedback and they know it's unrealistic, that's really unhelpful for them, right? So I try to train them about this by showing them examples of that in particular and why it's not a great response, even then you get that nonetheless. Yeah, the sincerity issue is hard. It's like that subtle tact thing that I think over time, if this were designed differently, another approach is to have respondents get to see other responses that are higher rated and start getting norms around that. And I think the crowd, if you're really careful, the crowd could start producing norms around responding that downvote tactless seeming responses, and that might over time help, but yeah.
Like poorly written could include too Pollyanna-ish or something.
Yeah,
get that.
You have to then explain what that is to people. So
Yeah.
like the moderation thing is a problem now because it takes time, and I'm working to make it faster.
Also, didn't you find the more depressed people tended to actually write the responses that were rated as more helpful?
The data is about even there.
About even?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, you.
So I was wondering whether people who use system like were more willing to talk to real people in the life. So like, for example, their family members, friends, or like they're actually seeing therapists.
Yeah, I have no idea. I did not look into that, but that's something I want to look into. I've been talking with some people about running further studies that look at peer support and just interactions offline afterwards. But I think that would be interesting.
My question is, you had a slide up there when you talked about alternate strategies being given. So the more people that are there in your social network, the more of these alternate strategies you would get from a CBT perspective, and that would somehow help you. Well, what I would want you to probably go into a little more detail is think of MIT and think of an MIT student and the support structures that are around students. Do you think, in your experience as a student, that we are capable of generating good alternate hypotheses there? Because the assumption there is some of those alternate suggestions you get from people are good. But what if you're immersed in a social network where you cannot generate those alternate suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to how that plays out at MIT specifically. I haven't done any field research on that. But I think your intuition is right that, and even at different stages of your life, I think the quality of responses you get from your peers is going to be different. I seem to, just reflecting on my undergrad experience, that I don't think I got like really good, necessarily sensitive, tactful reframes from my peers all the time. That's also a whole nother issue of like the developmental perspective. People's ability to do this, the research suggests, gets better over time. But yeah, I don't think there's an assumption that your peers are going to be good at that all the time. And I think that's kind of what motivated me to do this, is that you may have a peer network where just the structure of it is not such that people talk openly about these things even, or if they do, they might think they're being helpful, but not really. They may be well-intentioned, but yeah.
I'm going to keep going to new people. Patty, we'll see. Hi.
Hi, my question is a little bit the other end of the spectrum from the sincerity question. If you were trying to optimize for, say, more around speed and efficiency, and say you had, this was 2 years from now, and you had a lot more people on there, a lot more data on there already, you could imagine places where when someone posts a question, there's the exact same question that's been answered and posted by other people in the past. And there could be ways of kind of using data or sort of responses from the past if you feel like they're basically the same question, and those would not be sincere answers in that sense, because they're actually not meant for that purpose, but may get a person get help faster and a broader set of responses or whatever. What's your thought on that? Because there's obviously a trade-off around being efficient and being sincere. And
yeah, I think you pinpointed the exact trade-off in that approach. So the thing that happens is you start to see the same types of things appear over and over again. People often have the same types of anxieties. They're packaged a little bit differently, but in tandem, some of the responses that come back can also be somewhat dissimilar. So you could imagine it matching previous posts and previous responses and more efficiently just reusing stuff. I think my intuition, and I haven't tested this, but my intuition is that that's way less effective than knowing that someone took a few minutes to really think about you and think about your problem. So maybe like the way to manage that trade-off is for the respondent, show them examples and like use existing good solutions to help them form a better response quicker. There are other things you can do with speed though that don't involve that, right? So if you have a user on the system who has produced hundreds of really high-rated responses, you might not have to moderate them in the future. So that person's response could go much quicker.
Hi, so one of the major critiques of Reddit, for example, Reddit, like our depression or our quit smoking, is that when you ask questions, a lot of people become dependent, and in many ways you're giving people fish rather than teaching them how to fish. So I'm wondering if you're looking into mechanisms for users to kind of strengthen their own muscles in CBT rather than just asking for advice.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's come up several times. I think I may have a slide that shows how I did a little bit of that in the actual system that I didn't talk about. So just to paraphrase so people understand the question, here it is. So the idea is if you're just consuming information from people and not thinking about it and just passively being someone who posts all the time and just gets information, or a lurker or something like that, yeah, I agree. That's probably not that helpful. There are things I did in the system that touch on that a little bit. So before you actually can get a reframe response, the system asks you to do one for yourself. So this is something you see in like the online kind of apps a lot. But what's kind of neat here is you know that there's social messages behind this sort of firewall here. And so the hope is that this will encourage you to do it because you know that there are people behind it. And when I did this, I wasn't sure whether people would just write gibberish and click OK because they didn't want to do it. At least in the study, which is hard to generalize from, people actually, once they got going and started typing, from my knowledge, I looked through all of those, and they all were very sincere and looked like someone was taking a lot of time. But that's an interesting trade-off. Yeah, you have to be mindful of systems that just are crutches. The idea is that you want a crutch maybe from time to time, but you also want to help strengthen a person as they're leaning on the crutch somehow. Yeah.
Okay, we are out of time, and I know there are a lot more questions. We have a lunch set up with Rob afterwards. I think we have a few more slots still. If somebody really wants to engage with us, please come down and join us. Yeah, down in 240, yeah, here in the building, or hang out a few more minutes afterwards and ask questions individually. Join me in thanking Rob. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.